Okay, I'm hoping that now people will be able to hear me. So if you went on that little ride with me, I'm sorry. We will be starting at 7 o'clock. But hopefully this will get going in just a second. Okay, that was my test. Alright, so at least I know that I'm live and there's now sound. So grab a cup of tea, soda, coffee, whatever it is that you like, and meet me back here at 7. Okay. Hi everybody, welcome to Conquer the Clutter. No, I'm sorry about that, it's been a long day. This is actually StashBlaster Quilts. I'm a professional organizer by trade. Conquer the Clutter is my main company, so I apologize about that. But anyway, this is StashBlaster Quilts. And my job here is to help you be able to make more quilts in less time with less stress and have a good time, so that quilting is that haven for you that lets you kind of let the rest of the day go. It's been a very long day for me today, so there you are. I need this myself. But I did get to have some fun here in my studio earlier today, and I'm going to tell you about that a little bit later. I always start with a tip every time I do one of these live streams, which is the first and third Wednesday of every month. And so this time I'd like to talk to you about storing your projects midway. One of the things that people have a problem with sometimes is keeping track of all the little pieces, particularly if you're doing a quilt that has a few hundred to a few thousand pieces in it. And it can be very easy to make that mistake. So one of my favorite things to do is to have a master list of the pieces that I need, and then I group them into zip type bags. So here's an example of one here. But I don't know if you can see here, but I wrote on the freezer line what was in here. The problem with that is then reusing this bag becomes much more difficult. So I use blue painter's tape now. I write with a Sharpie type marker, and I put that on my bag, and I can reuse the bags over and over and over and over again. Another thing I tend to do, particularly with the gallon size, because I like the freezer bags and I like to use them, if I am out and about, let's say I'm going to my Quilt Guild meeting and I want to trim blocks while I'm there, because that's one of the things I do while I'm listening to a business meeting or something, is I have, this is an old broken chunk of a mat, and I just went ahead, I just snapped it, and I made it small enough to go into the bag, and now I have a self-healing mat that is a good size, and if I lose it, forget it, it gets destroyed, I don't care. And this way I get to use even more of the mat even after the mat's just pretty much gone from general use and needs to be replaced. So that's something else that I do. So that's your tip for the week. A lot of times I have a lot more than that. This is a pretty low stress tip, and we're going to go ahead and go on to the quilt that we're working on together. By the way, if you are enjoying this as we go, please subscribe. Like it would be even better, or in addition. And then if you hit the little bell, it'll tell you when I'm back on. I am here every first and third Wednesday of the month doing the live stream. And if life ever calms down, I'm going to then be editing the live streams down into smaller clips and things to put on the web, on the YouTube channel, so that you can just get the tip, or you can just get a technique that I talk about maybe later in the live stream. But as a group, we decided on creating a quilt this year. I gave 4 choices, and the one that was chosen was to use old 4 patches that are leftover orphan type blocks, and to go ahead and put those into a quilt with a little bit of a twist. So that's what we're doing. I gave 5 different layout options last time, and I gave everyone a week to make a decision, and they chose number 3. That's this one here. It's pretty simple. It's 2-inch, 4-inch, and 8-inch 4 patches cut on a wonky design into a rectangular quilt. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. So I pulled out, here, let me go to the widescreen so you can see this here. I pulled out my bin here of orphan blocks. The big drawers at the bottom, 2 of these were full of my 4 patches. And so I took them out, I sorted them, and I have decided for me, I want to use one of the 3 categories that I sorted into last time. One was had black color, or blackish on the diagonal pieces. One had white or whitish colors on the diagonals, and one was kind of a medium mishmash. So I've decided to go with the white ones. And so there's white on white, there's cream, pink, blue, white with flowers, those kinds of things. But they basically read as white. And so I had a client cancel today, so I had some extra time. So I have gotten ahead and done some of the cutting. And so I'll show you kind of where that is on the wall in a little bit. But let's talk about what do you do if you don't have enough 4 patches. And we talked last time about how to size up to make sure you are using the right size blocks. But there was one thing that I didn't mention that I always do when I'm sewing my 4 patches. And I'd like to explain that now. So let me change to this camera. I know this is a mess. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. So this is a 4 patch that I sewed. I'm going to put this gray here to make it a little bit easier. I like to spin the centers of my block. So I'm going to put this up to the camera so you can see a little bit better. So do you see how these all lay flat? Okay. The way I do that is when I have my my 2 patches sewn. Okay, remember I've cut this wonky so it doesn't look quite normal. But I'll have my 2 patches and I'm sewing them together. I always sew it to assemble the 4 patch with the flap here facing up. So I can feed this through. I've got it pinned and I feed this through and the flap is always going up. Now, why do you do that? If we were not cutting these wonky and we were trying to put these 4 patches together, if you've sewn them the same way, they'll rotate the same way in how your seams are laid out. If you're pressing all your seams open, you don't have to worry about that. I like to press mine to the side wherever I can. So when I have a 4 patch like this, if I have sewn it that way, and so here's one where I sewed it the other way. Here, let me show you. Sorry. So here you can tell when I sewed this one, the flap was down. When I sewed this one, the flap was up. So you see that? Now, if I go to put these 2 together, what winds up happening is that both of the seams are pressed the same direction. Okay, do you see that? Now, if I did it right, whichever way you decide to do it, either up or down, but let's say this one shows it going up, right? And we know this one was sewn, this one, see that one was wrong. So this one was sewn, sorry, with the flap up again. Can you see that? When I go to put these together, then the seams are going in opposite directions. And that way they'll nest. And I don't wind up with all that bulk in the middle. So the advantage is by always doing it consistently. Either way, you can have it go down or you can have it go up. But if you sew it consistently, if you are doing a pattern where you want to match them and not have problems getting your seams to align, then you're going to want to always sew them with either the flap up or the flap down. I like up because then it pushes the upper piece into the lower piece and nests that in nice and tight. While it's not important, to where you need to be terrified that your middle of your 4 patch isn't going to match, the neater your center is, the better. It is very rare that I need to undo my 4 patches. So you can see here, I got a nice crisp 4 patch there. And same thing on this one. Okay? So the closer you can have it to where it's working for you, as opposed to fighting you and potentially pulling apart, the better. So that's why I do mine with the flap up. But as long as you're consistent, it'll work. And then what you do is this. Now these are already done, so it doesn't really help as much as I'd like, but because I got ahead today. So once you've sewn this seam, you're going to release this seam just a little bit, a couple of stitches, and what that's going to allow you to do is when you've sewn it, it would look like this, right? But you'll be able to pull the color that's facing you back and then this flap from the two patch, and that's what gives you your spin here. That means you only have 2 parts of your seam on each of these corners instead of 4 on one side. Okay, so that's why this is a benefit. And then when you press, you'll be pressing the 2 opposite directions. You'll do the same thing with this one. And then when you go to put them together, the flaps are on opposite sides, and you can do the same thing again and again and again and again. When you go to put the rows together, it happens again. Because they're all spinning the same direction at the opposite side, it'll go the opposite direction. So these will be ready to nest together. So if you wanted to do a quilt that was a lot of 4 patches, or you're assembling other blocks, but you're assembling them piece to piece so that you have 2 blocks and then 2 blocks, and you're going to assemble them together as a giant 4 patch, and maybe it's Friendship Star or something. This will make sure that row to row to row will all match up and be a lot neater and cleaner and a lot less bulk to deal with. So that's the first thing. Now, I did tell you when we were doing this project, because I'm going to be doing this right along with you, you are going to have the opportunity to watch me mess up. And so I'm going to show you a mess up that I did. And then we're going to talk about what I can do about it, if anything. So let's come back here. So I sewed this 4 patch. It was a regular 4 patch. And then I pressed it, and I spun the seam, and I squared it up on a wonky angle. And then I noticed, do you see right here? It looks like a shadow. It's not. Apparently, after I pressed it, I had spritzed and pressed a piece that had green on it and laid it on top, and I didn't notice the color transfer. This is actually green ink, green dye, excuse me, from the other piece. It comes right to here. You can just barely see it. Maybe that's better. Yeah, you can just see it here, and then it comes across and it goes up to here. So I have this rectangular thing right in the middle. This is all wrinkled now because I went ahead and I tried all kinds of things to clean it out and get rid of the excess dye. But unfortunately, I had pressed this really well. This is in here permanently. So I cannot use this as is. It's just simple. I can't. Now, one thing that I can do is I could go ahead, cut out this part with the green, okay, and then use these pieces for other things. I can certainly do that. But since it's already cut like this, I've already lost some of the material. This is a case where you might just decide to let it go. If you do, there is no guilt. If you want to, you could put it in a scrap bag to go into a dog quilt, a dog bed or something like that, if you're concerned about the wastage. I will probably cut the square out and use the pieces in other ways. Just like I'm going to take the pieces that are cut off of the 4 patches to make them wonky, I'm going to save them and I'm going to use them again. And so at a little bit later, we're going to talk about potential ways to use those scraps. But that's completely up to you, whatever you're comfortable with. Okay, so let's talk about cutting. Now that we have our 4 patches done, let me move this back over to this camera. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and cut this. We talked about last time about how to make sure that your 4 patch is large enough. Our finished cuts out of the 4 patch are going to be 2.5, 4.5, and 8.5. So we finish at 2, 4, and 8. So this happens to be an 8.5 inch ruler. I really like having my rulers be the size I need to cut, particularly when I'm doing a lot of them. If you wanted, I mentioned this last time, you can always use a larger ruler, and to make sure that you don't miss a line, you can use a little bit of blue tape and do a corner here so that you'll know when you've lined it up properly. However, I happen to have the 8.5, and it'll be easier for this demonstration, so I'm going to do that. Now, when we talked about sizing, we mentioned that the closer you are to the standard size blocks to get the 4 patch that we're looking for, the less rotational ability you're going to have. So in this particular case, I have a lot here. Okay, I can not only rotate it, but I can also slide it up. Now this is from an old strip set that I was doing, which is why the white and the strip are not the same size. But that doesn't matter in this case if they hang over a little bit. In fact, that makes the wonky cut even a little bit easier. One thing to keep in mind is, let's say you want to capture this flower and keep this in your final block. You need to make sure you have the 1/4 of an inch all the way around, because you're going to lose that in your seam allowance. So that may affect where you want to put your ruler and how much you want to rotate. There's another flower on this side. I can't really get them both. I can really focus in on one and make sure I get all that and maybe only part of this one, or I can get as much of this one as possible. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to align like this. So I'm right next to where this is a little bit raveled, and then I'm going to make sure this is in as close as possible, and that my flower is completely inside the block. Now, when your material goes past here, past the ruler, there's a couple of choices that you can make. In this particular case, what I would do is I just have, this is an old ruler that I just happen to have lying around, which is more than long enough. I will lay this up against my 8.5, move the 8.5 to the side, and then I'll go ahead and cut, just like that. Then this goes on my scrap pile, and then I can align the rest of these. Now, I was watching Karen Brown. You know that I'm a big fan of hers, and she uses exercise weights, the bar weights, and she'll put them on a ruler to keep things from slipping. I have found with this rotational mat that I tend to spin it a little bit quick, and then my ruler can shift. This does have the grippy stuff on the back, but it's not quite enough in this case. So I don't happen to have any of those workout mats, weights handy, but I do have a giant tub of glue. It's filled to here, so it's still got some weight to it. And so what I'm going to do is I'll just hold down, you can't see that. Alright, I'm not cutting this properly, okay? This should be at the 90-degree rotation. But I will hold it down, and then I will cut like that. And I'll cut my other two sides. I'm sorry I'm so right-handed. If I wasn't, then I could do this so you could see better, but that's not to be. Okay. Now, you could cut two sides and then just move this to the other side, then cut the other two sides. It just happened to work out nicely this way. And voila, there's my 8.5 wonky cut 4 patch block. Okay, now some of the blocks that I cut were way out of whack. They might have been twice as wide from the from the intersection on one side as the other. But again, in this case, it doesn't matter. I can cut this to however my fabric works and use up as much of the fabric as possible. So I'm going to just set that aside. Now let's talk about some of these scraps. Now some of these are bigger and better than others. And some of them I cut square just so that the pattern would be right side up. So you could take, let's say, these two and then put them together as a 4-patch. Here's a good one. You could take these two as a 4-patch, right? Now, you'll notice that this is a little wonky. So you could either clean up the edge and do it that way, or just leave it wonky. Who cares? Okay? Because if I sewed these together, this seam is on a diagonal. So then you either trim it up square, or maybe you've cut this out of a big piece of material and now you want to use it for maybe a 2-inch square in our block. So sometimes you can use your scraps again in the same quilt that we're doing. But if not, it wouldn't hurt to have it in your stash to do that. Or you can always subcut this down into blocks or bricks or hexagons for an English paper piecing or whatever else you want to use this for. I certainly would not just toss this fabric. Worst comes to worst, this is an improv quilt already started, or an improv strip to add to another quilt, or even just on a quilt backing for fun. So these are going to go just as they are into a bin. I'm not going to just toss willy-nilly, but I'm not going to worry overly much about how to do this. I might go ahead and rescue some of these, like this one maybe, and maybe do some 1.5-inch blocks to put in some of these blocks on the main quilt. So what do I mean about that? Just because we've designed blocks at 2, 4, and 8 doesn't mean that you can't subdivide those blocks. If I have a 2-inch, well, let's say an 8-inch block here, okay, I could keep one block solid and then have 4-inch blocks here that would make the 8-inch block ultimately. So, you know, you can really integrate these things so that you can give it a lot more depth and a lot more activity. These blocks are fairly large. I don't tend to make blocks this size, so this is kind of an exercise for me as well. But if I wanted to, this could be subdivided. Okay? And actually this would be 4 2-inch blocks, I'm sorry, not 4-inch blocks. But I could take 4 1-inch blocks and turn it into a 2.5, or however you want to do it. And then either use solids or do something else. There's lots of flexibility with this. So I just want to have you kind of keep that in mind. So I'm going to show you here. Now it looks like these blocks are on an angle. It's actually the quilt behind me that's on an angle because of where my camera is. If I hang my quilt straight, it looks like it's way off. So please understand that it just looks a little weird, but you're going to have to kind of be a little flexible with me here. So if we look over here, I've started laying out my 8-inch blocks just to see if I like them. Okay? Now, you could audition your blocks before cutting them. But keep in mind, you're going to be looking at much larger blocks in order to cut it down to the 8.5. They're going to take up a lot more space, and it's going to look like a much larger quilt. But that's okay. All right? But you can audition them before. I just went to my stash and saw what I had that had white or white-ish for my corners, and that's what's up here. Okay? Now, off here on the side, you can see I have the rest of my 8-inch blocks right here. Okay, and then below I have the 4-inch blocks, and I've started cutting the 2s. They're up there. The 8s are not, but the 4s and the 2s are bundled in 10s because I'm not done counting them, so that I don't know if I have enough yet. If you wanted, you could start either with the 8s or the 2s and work your way out. I started with the 8s because I said, okay, I may have these scraps that I can use to make my 2s, so why not, right? So in this particular case, I want to finish with my 2s. But if you wanted to, you could do just the 2 center, and that's going to give you a 24-inch wide quilt, just all on its own, square, and you would be able to just stop there if you wanted to, and it would be this kind of confetti-y looking thing. You can see from the 8-inch blocks in the top corner there that there's some overlapping color. There's the whites are kind of on a diagonal, which gives you a little bit of consistency in terms of the visual pattern. But you could also change this. So let me show you here. Let me grab my mic. If you wanted to, particularly this will be noticeable in the 2s instead of here in the 8s, you could rotate these like this. So one row goes one way and then the other row goes the other way. So in this one, the white is in the upper right hand corner, and I reversed it here, and what'll happen is you'll get blocks where you've got white next to white. I don't think I care for this one as much, but let me move these just to kind of give a better idea. So this is this. Okay, and then this one would go the other way. This is the advantage to having the design wall too, is that you can play around with a lot of options. And I would take a photograph after I did each one of these so that I would know which ones I liked better. And if I liked it partially one way and partially the other way, that's fine too. Now you could also take this and say, okay, I want all the colored pieces together. Now these upper ones are really high. Like this. And then all the white pieces together. Like that. White. White. Color. Okay. So this isn't going to give you an actual pinwheel effect, but you'll have bigger blocks of white and then blocks of color. So you could do that, and if you wanted to, you could have like these 4 all maybe in warm colors, and then work your way down into the cooler colors, because each one of these, you couldn't do, let's say, these 4 purple and just these a different color, because these are still going to intersect with the next 4. But you could do, let's say, purples into blues into greens into yellow, etc., and work your way down to red at the other end. So that would be an option as well. I've looked at this design, and I'm not sure about this one either. I think I like the original better, but it's certainly an option. Now there are some blocks that I did where I was careful to make sure that I paid attention to direction. So if you look here, these pots, excuse me, sorry about that. I wanted to make sure that they were all right side up when I sewed these. So you might want to pay attention if you're sewing 4 patches to put on this, to make sure if it's a directional print that you keep your directions the same. But then what that means is that when they go into the quilt, if you're not having them all with, let's say, the right on the right hand side or the left hand side, whichever side. If you're not doing that, I mean, excuse me, if you are doing that, you don't want to have it where it means that your print's going to be upside down or on the side. Okay? So if we said that this is the corner that had to be white, you can see that these particular ornaments are now on their sides. So if you're doing this, then the idea would be you want it so that the upright will be on this particular corners. Okay, the upper, well, to you it's the upper left and the lower right. To me it's the reverse. I'm still learning this whole everything is inverted thing with the design, with the cameras. So I hope that that makes sense, and so that when you're doing this, you're prepared for that. Now, these ones that are more upright designs, I tended to cut straight up and down, but just slid off to the side, versus making it truly wonky and then making the vases or the ornaments or the whatevers they are then all kind of lean drunkenly. Okay, I didn't want that. I wanted them to be upright in the quilt, so I've made them so that they'll be upright in the quilt. So I hope that that makes sense when in your cutting. That's something else to keep in mind other than just making sure you capture the flower, if that's something that's important. Okay, so let's talk about the design. Let me get my scraps out of the way first, and then I'll change the camera again. Okay, so the design is incredibly simple. It's going to be 12 rows of 12, 2 patches in the middle, 2-inch patches. Here, let me see if I can do this without making people sick. There we go. Hopefully that's not too bad. Okay, so this middle section here is going to be 2-inch blocks. The green is going to be our 4-inch blocks, and then the blue will be our 8-inch blocks. So what this means is, I don't know if you can see this here, we are going to need to make a quilt that's 48 by 72, 144 2-inch blocks. We're going to need 44 4-inch blocks and 34 8-inch blocks. So that should give you an idea of how many you're going to want. I would recommend that you keep some extras, maybe that aren't cut yet, so that when you are laying out your quilt, you'll be able to say, okay, there's too much blue, there's too much dark, there's too much whatever, and then you can cut just the last ones you need to give it better balance. So I hope that that makes sense. So in my particular case, I am going to make 2 of these at the same time. So I have lots of extras. I'm going to do the first one as a gift, most likely. So I'm going to be paying a little bit more attention to the color balance and things like that. And then all my leftover ones are going to wind up in a charity quilt. So if I don't get it perfect, it'll still be fine. So just to keep in mind, this might be one where you start it and you're like, I thought that was going to be cool, but I just don't like it. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's no reason to waste all that work either. So if you do this, keep in mind, if you don't like it, that's fine. There's other things you can do with it. Speaking of other things you can do with it, let's talk about the scraps again. I meant to give you some other ideas too. So I'm hoping that this will work. Okay, so something you could do with something like this. I'm over here, I'm reaching over into my drawer unit because I have my orphan blocks here. Here, I'll switch that so you can see it. Now I gotta go to the wide shot. So all of my orphans are in here. So I have square to square, general orphan, flying geese, half square triangles, 4 patches, etc. in this particular grouping. But in my collection, I have pieces like this. So as you can see, there's one fabric here and a different one here, and then it's built into this half square triangle. Now, You could, depending on what quilt you were making, need for them to be specific sizes, specific colors, or specific color families, that kind of thing. Because maybe you're trying to do something that has a kind of a wonky star shape or something, so you want those little bits there to be a particular shading. I kind of like just having these to throw in some extra interest into a quilt. So these aren't in my half square triangle section because they're not quote unquote standard half square triangles, but you could certainly use them like them. So you could go ahead and take this piece and maybe another one, maybe this one, okay? And then match it up where this is on the diagonal of a square, sew down both sides, and then you'd have two half square triangles where each side had two different materials. Why the squares? I would prefer to take a square and sew something down the diagonal each way rather than cutting triangles and having triangles around that I'm trying to deal with later. In case this doesn't make sense, how about I grab from behind you, so it's good. I'll be gone for just a second. I'm going to grab some squares to show you what I mean. So I'm just walking around to behind you, and let me grab, let's say a 3-inch block. So this is a 3-inch block. That's just part of my stash. It's one that I have subcut. Okay. So let me move over here. So I would take this, and then you could lay, let's say this one this way on the diagonal. And then this one could go this way. And I would butt it up so that it's also on the diagonal. It doesn't matter as much here which way the seam flap goes, because it's going to be in the middle of the block when we're done, and you're not going to try to have to match that seam up to anywhere. If you sew 1/4 inch on each side, then what you'll have is a half square triangle like this, okay? And so we can kind of imagine that like that. And then the other one would be a half square triangle. It would be smaller, but it would come like that. So again, if you don't want to do the 4 patches, this might be another option for you. These are not obviously matched up perfectly, and I haven't messed around with them to see what I can come up with. But these are 2 definite options that I might have. A third option we've talked about before, and of course I moved them, so hold on again, sorry. Another option would be to use paper, and there's a couple of different kinds of paper that you can use. This is another thing I got from Karen Brown. This is adding machine paper. Okay, so here's what you could do. These are cut, but they wouldn't have to be other than just for convenient size. And so you could sew these down, and you could even make them even wonkier again if you wanted to. Actually, why don't I put this one on? Now we can maybe do this one this way. Okay, we're pretending that I've sewn it down and flipped it over, okay, like you normally would. But you could add a whole bunch of these in until you completed the strip. And then when the strip was done, you could incorporate that into a quilt. You would, once this was all done and pressed, and you'd press every time that you've added, and if you add to both sides, then you can sew both on and then press, so you cut down on your trips to the ironing board. You give it a 1/4 inch around the paper, and so that's your final size. The advantage to that is that you keep the paper on until you've sewn it to something else, but if you are 1/4 inch away, then you're barely catching the edge of the paper. It'll come off like a dream. Okay, so that's an option. You can also do things like this. This is some newsprint that I bought online. Now, unfortunately, I meant to get 8.5 by 11 so that I could print on it for English paper piecing. But instead, I apparently ordered, this is 6 by 9. So, I now have a lot of 6 by 9. There's no reason that I can't use this for the same kind of an idea for some of these longer pieces. Okay? And then I would wind up with a 6 by 6 or a 6 by 9 or whatever size block I wound up with by doing improvisational quilting. Now, if you don't know how to do improvisational quilting or you haven't done it or you'd like to see it, you can either send me an email at mail@StashBlasterQuilts.com. You can leave a comment in the chat, or you can go to my website and leave me a message there. Now, the website is still a problem. It is tax season for the company, so Scott is still trying to get taxes done, and then we've had all kinds of computer things he's had to do this week. So he still hasn't had a chance to work on the website. As soon as he has it up, I promise I will let you know so that you can go and check it out, because I have quilt patterns available there and some of the other tips and tricks and things. So that's where that stands at this point. But those are just a couple of the things that you can do with the scraps that isn't going to be just a waste of the material. One of the things that really bothers me is wasting material. So these are options to help use them up in a way that will be useful. And even with these, you're going to have potentially usable scraps. That's one of the things about being a scrap quilter, is you can make, 50 quilts in a year that's all scrap that came out of your collection, and all you did was you made smaller scraps, but you still have scraps. So it's a kind of like a self-fulfilling stash issue for people like me that do this. But I really love it. I love having all the different color options. I like having the different design options. I had never done improvisational quilting until about 5 years ago. And that's what this, the quilt that we're working on, no, not the one behind me, the one over here, the twisted 4-patch. It's improvisational. We're not going to worry about exactly how are we cutting the 4 patches. We're just winging it, and then we're slapping it together, and we're going to have something kind of cool at the end, I think. So improvisational quilting is a little bit more than that, but it's still not adhering to these rigid, gotta be perfect, gotta do it exactly like that kind of standard. You can be a lot more flexible, you can be a lot more open, and it goes a lot faster if you're not that worried about it. So that helps too. Alright, so we still have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to cut some more squares. Here we are. Let me get my newsprint and things out of the way. Okay, so if you didn't write it down before, in order to make the quilt that we're making, you're going to want 144 2-inch squares. So that's 2-inch finished. So you'll be cutting it at 2.5. And then you're going to want 44 4-inch finished, so 4.5-inch squares, and 34 of the 8-inch finished 8.5-inch raw squares. Now, this is the block I told you was not ironed, not sewn the same order as the rest. This is the perfect job to use this on. Since we're not putting together these 4 patches where those seams are going to be butting up against each other all the time, and we're cutting everything wonky, the odds are we're not going to be having our seams near each other anyway. They may be close, but they're not going to be doing the same interaction where we have to keep nesting things together. So if you have 4 patches that are cut differently than you want to do them moving forward, this is the perfect project for that, because those seams are not going to have to nest. Okay? So I had shown you this block, and this is the one that's done the other direction, but it doesn't matter. Let me put this block away. Okay. So, obviously, too small for the 8.5-inch block, which is fine because I think I have enough of those anyway. This is fine for the 4.5. Now, this is actually a 6-inch half square triangle. It's 6.5, but we're not worried about lining it up exactly. But with my 4.5 being here to here, okay, as long as the 4.5 on both sides, here and here, and my 4.5 intersection here are all on the material, we're good. Now in this particular case, I think I am going to slide it down a little bit, like this. Now before, I showed you the using the other ruler, because the fabric continuing on well past this corner here. This is close enough that I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to go ahead and cut it. Okay. Now I am going to cut across because, like I mentioned before, this does tend to shift. If you don't have a big old tub of glue, you can use something like this. This is a snowman candy dish that I filled with M&Ms years ago, and I gave one to my mother. So when she passed away, I got the snowman back. And that's just to keep this from moving around. Now, obviously, I don't need it at the moment to do that, but here he is. Oops. I keep forgetting which way to turn things so you can see them. There we go. When I filled these before, I sorted the M&Ms by color and then did a rainbow going up. I can't tell you how many years I spent doing stuff like that when my son was small, where I was sorting M&Ms or something like that all night in front of the TV. I must have bought 50 of these, and I gave them as presents to my son's teachers for the holidays. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't Santa, it wasn't anything like that, because you never know the religion of the teacher. And so I didn't want to be offensive, because even if the teacher's Christian, the family might not be. And so I wanted to be sure that I came up with something winter that was not potentially offensive. So I was very careful when my son was small to deal with that way. Okay, again, this is obviously not going to be an 8-inch block. Now, I'm thinking, do I want to offset this? Or do I want to make it wonky? I think I'm going to make it wonky. I want most of my pieces to be on the angle. If you're going to either make it wonky or square, don't make it a true 4-patch. Okay, this is a 6-inch, so you would not want to line this up exactly on the 3 and trim around it so that it's a perfect 4-patch. You're going to want to make sure that you are either obviously on an angle or you're way off center so that it's obvious, that's intentional. If you're only off like this much, they're going to think you miscut. Okay, they're not going to realize that it wasn't intended to be perfect. So if you're going to do it, make it obvious. Now, I could twist this so that, here, let me move you back over here. It might be easier to see. Okay. So that it's exactly to all of these corners, like right on the edge as much as possible. But I'm not worried about that. It can be off and then dragged up towards one side like this. That'll take it even further off the center, which is what I think I'm going to do here. Again, in this particular case, I'm just going to drag it back. And my ruler did shift, but all I have to do is line it back up with the cut fabric and then give her a slice. And we're good. Okay, so this is the situation where, let me put this back. Like I said, my rulers for some reason tend to slide more on this one, which shouldn't make a difference. It really shouldn't. So I'm just going to plop him on there, and then I'm going to rotate. Okay. And then I'm going to cut this side. Oops, I slid just a little bit. Okay. I'm going to spin it again. See how far off I am. Actually, I'm not really that far off at all, but that's good. Okay, so now my snowman's belly is hanging over the edge. All I have to do is hold the ruler in place and move him over. Okay. If you have the weights, those are really handy because they have a handle built in. So it's easy to pick it up and move it around. It also works particularly well for long cuts. So if you are doing with the fabric strips, if you can put a nice heavy weight on one end, it'll help keep you from having your ruler wobble as you go. So that's just an idea with him. Again, all right, so here we go. What did I do? I cut a 6-inch square. We don't have any 6-inch blocks. So now here's my question to myself. All right, what do I want to do? Do I want to now just swing this down on one side like this so that it's at 4.5? Like that? Do I want to rotate it even further and cut 4.5? Which would be here. I could certainly do that. I think I want it a little bit further off. So my 4.5 here is good. My 4.5 intersection here is good. 4.5 and the point. So I'm going to leave it right where it is. But you know what? These things happen where you're zipping along. In my case, I'm trying to talk to you, and you make a mistake. So if you're cutting your 8-inch squares and you make a mistake, well, now it's going to be a 4-inch square, and then it's going to be a 2-inch square, and after that, then it's a 1-inch, or you throw it out, or you piece it with something else, and you just give, you use it in another way. Because there's no reason you can't use these wonky blocks in any other quilt. If it's got any blocks, whatever size you cut this, so in this case a 6-inch block, I could have just taken this 4-patch and put it into any quilt where it calls for a 6-inch block. Okay? I just didn't want to. I want to recut this. So, okay, so now I need my 4.5. Okay. Now I'm all aligned. I always hang at least one finger off so that it's on the mat. Now, I really love these rotary mats, but sometimes they will rotate when you don't intend them to. So I also tend to put my belly up against it, just to make sure it isn't spinning when I don't want it to. So there we go. There's a 4.5-inch block. So that's pretty cool. All right. Now that does mean I wound up with these extra skinny ones of these, but these would work fine on the tape that we talked about. It just means a smaller seam allowance. And I'll often do maybe 1/8 of an inch on some of the pieces on the machine tape, because I can go ahead and use that paper. It continues to hold it in place until it's sewn to other things. And at that point, it's locked down to the outside edges, and so you're good. Okay, so let's not do 6-inch this time. Let's do the 4.5 we're intending, shall we? So here's my 4.5 lined and my corner. So I think this one shows more like a rose. So I think I'm going to go ahead and put this down this way. So I think that's where I want it. Now, I have all this extra material like I did that first time. So I'm going to rotate this just a little. Then I'm going to use this. By the way, that problem with cutting the 6 when you want the 4.5, that's one of the reasons why I like having square rulers in a lot of different sizes. it just makes it easier. You don't have to think about it or remember to tape it. But there's no reason you have to spend the money on them if you don't want to. Okay, so I'm going to rotate it this way. And I'm going to go ahead and line up the 4.5 again. And put this other ruler on again. So, okay. And then cut. Okay, so now my strip is 4.5 inches wide. And now I can take another look at it and say, okay, if I take it all the way to the end, it would line up here. Is that where I want it? Do I want to move it down this way a little bit more? The only thing is that when you get to your cut edge, that's as far as it can go. So 4.5 would go here. I think that I still like the, this particular material has this rose sort of shape to it. So I want to preserve as much of that as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and square it up on this end. And spin. And then 4.5 lined up there. There we go. And there's our other 4.5. Now, this is an example where I was talking about where you can have a nice big chunk, even though the 4 patch wasn't that large. It was about 6.5 inches square to start with. But out of this, I can get almost I can get a 2.25 inch. Nah, it's about a 2-inch square out of it, because I'm here at my 2. But it is a good size where, since I'm also paper piecing hexagons right now, I can go ahead, because that would be one edge here. I might be able to fit one of my hexagons out of this nicely. So I may take it down and do that with it as well. Okay, I only have a couple of these left to cut, and then I will be done cutting everything except for the 2s. Okay, so my 4.5s. Okay, my 4.5 is on here. My 4.5 is there. My corner here is well in the margin. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut these. So next time, I'm going to finish cutting whatever needs to be cut. And then I will be working with you on what's the final layout going to be. If you have any opinions on the layout, you are more than welcome to send those to me again at mail@StashBlasterQuilts.com or a comment in the chat. Okay, now in this particular case, I just go ahead and I let it go off to the side because I'm not worrying about it all that much at the moment. I have enough ways that I'm going to use scraps, so I'm not going to worry about it that much. But that's up to you. Anyway, so mail@StashBlasterQuilts.com, or you leave a message in the chat and let me know whether you liked the original design that I had up there, all the whites together and color pieces together, or the alternating rows that I showed you. And we'll kind of see where we go from there. It was actually funny because I have some friends of mine who watch, but they haven't subscribed, which I don't understand, but that's okay. And what they do is they call me up and give me their opinions as opposed to doing either of those methods that I told you about. So, you know, if you're one of my friends that does that, that's fine too. But since I'm hoping that at some point people will be watching this and not know me as well, then I'm going to give you these methods. Now keep in mind that this is February 2nd, 2022. So if you're watching this later, let's say in 2025, you've missed your boat. It's gone. You're out of luck. But we'll be doing something else at that point, so you can jump on the bandwagon for that one. So this is my last 4.5-inch square. And this should give me about 10 extras at this point. Which means I need to make some more, because like I said, I'm going to do 2 quilts. But I will have plenty for this one. And for those of you who are seeing this for the first time, the idea is that we're going to work on this quilt during the course of the year. And you can either just sit and watch as things get sewn together and I explain stuff, or you can do one of your own. If you do, I'd love to see photos. But people have told me sometimes they like to just sit and watch other people work, so we're going to see how that goes. If it goes well, then every year we will design another quilt together, like we designed this one, and then we'll sew it together, and by the time we're done, we'll have a finished quilt. Including quilting, binding, the whole shebang. Now this is a very easy quilt because the pieces were already done. These, like I said, these were from the Orphan 4 patches. Okay, so my blade slipped there, so I need to make sure, get it lined up, so I can finish that cut. These were all from old 4 patches that I had, either because they were left from a project, or it was one of those 2 a.m. I gotta sew something projects. I make a lot of 4 patches that way. So in this particular case, we're much further ahead than we would be if we were doing one of the other quilt categories that we talked about. So if we were doing, let's say, that 3D modern that we were talking, we'd still be in the plotting and planning stages and trying to figure out the pattern pieces and all of that, as opposed to now, we're getting close to starting assembly, so this is going to be a very short turnaround on this one. But the options being what they were, I wanted to make sure that we had the whole year to do it. So we'll do other projects later on this year once this one is done. But I wanted to make sure that I left enough time that we'd be able to sew this together, etc., as we went and get it done in the course of the year. It is after 8 o'clock. Please, if you've enjoyed this, like, subscribe, hit the bell, and I will go ahead and close this, and I will see you the first and third Wednesday of every month at 7 o'clock. Okay? Take care, and let's go do some sewing.